The October rain hammered against the window of Ava Morgan's cramped Denver apartment as she stared at the corkboard covering her living room wall. Photographs, newspaper clippings, and red string connecting dots that no one else seemed to see. 17 missing persons in 8 months. 17 lives erased from small towns across America, places that rarely made national headlines. Her hands trembled as she pinned another article. A 32-year-old teacher from rural Montana who vanished from her apartment without a trace, leaving behind a half-eaten dinner and her 7-year-old son sleeping upstairs. 3 years ago, Ava would have dismissed this as coincidence. She'd built her reputation on skepticism, on dismantling conspiracy theories with surgical precision, on proving that tragedy was usually just tragedy, not evidence of some grand hidden truth. But 3 years ago, her older brother Marcus was alive. Marcus had disappeared from a hiking trail near the Colorado-Wyoming border in March, in circumstances that still made her stomach clench. The authorities called it an accident, a tragic disappearance in rough terrain. They searched for 2 weeks and found nothing, no body, no explanation. The case went cold, filed away with dozens of others that the system had deemed unsolvable. Since then, Ava had become obsessed with the margins. The cases authorities didn't prioritize. The missing persons from marginalized communities, from rural areas where police resources were stretched thin, from places where a person could vanish and the machinery of justice would barely grind forward. She'd quit her mainstream journalism position at a major publication, burned bridges with editors who thought she was chasing ghosts. Now she freelanced, barely scraping by, her reputation transformed from respected investigator to conspiracy theorist. The knock on her door at 11 p.m. was unexpected. She almost didn't answer. The man standing in her doorway was weathered in a way that suggested years of carrying something heavy. Mid-50s, with dark eyes that had seen too much and a jaw perpetually clenched as if holding back words he'd learned not to say. Daniel Reyes. She recognized him immediately. His face had been circulated in journalism circles 5 years ago when he quit the FBI abruptly, before the scandal that followed had time to fully develop. "Ms. Morgan, I've been reading your work," he said without preamble, his voice rough from disuse or emotion. "The pattern you're documenting, I think I can help." Ava's instinct was to turn him away. Ex-agents bearing information in the dark showed up in bad movies, and real life was supposed to be more rational than that. But something in his expression, a desperation that mirrored her own, made her step aside. "How did you find me?" "The same way you found the pattern, by looking where others refused to." He moved to her corkboard without invitation, his eyes scanning the connections she'd painstakingly mapped. "I worked 17 cases like this. Missing persons with no clear circumstances, no bodies, no ransom demands. Every time we got close to connecting them, someone would shut us down. Internal pressure, budget cuts, cases reassigned to agents who didn't care. Why should I trust you?" Ava heard the challenge in her own voice, the defensive mechanism of someone who'd learned that hope was dangerous. "Because your brother Marcus disappeared on March 14th near Summit Lake, and because I was the agent who found something the official report never mentioned." He turned to face her, and she saw the weight of years pressing down on him. "There's a connection between these disappearances that goes deeper than random tragedy, and I think you're the only journalist good enough to actually prove it." Ava felt her breath catch. No one outside her family knew the exact date Marcus disappeared. Not publicly. This man knew details that had been deliberately buried. "Show me," she whispered. The following morning they met at a diner outside Boulder, far enough from Denver to feel like neutral ground. Daniel arrived with a worn leather folder containing photocopies of case files, arrest records, and witness statements that had been marked confidential. His fingers trembled slightly as he spread them across the booth table, and Ava realized this was the first time he'd shared this burden with anyone in 5 years. 17 cases from 2015 to 2020. Daniel explained, his voice low enough that the waitress refilling their coffee couldn't hear. Missing persons spread across 6 states, different ages, demographics, occupations. On the surface, nothing connects them. But when you look at the timing, the locations, and what happened to the investigations, there's a structure. Someone orchestrated the disappearances. Multiple someones, actually. Ava leaned forward, her journalistic instincts awakening. What kind of structure? The missing persons came from vulnerable populations, undocumented immigrants, people with mental health issues, individuals estranged from family, transient workers, people whose absence might go unreported for days or weeks. But here's what disturbed me. In every case, there was a connection to either a federal facility, a private detention center, or a regional law enforcement agency. You're suggesting government involvement? Ava's skepticism flickered. This was the territory where credibility died. Not government directly, Daniel said carefully, but people within government, contractors, officials with access to movement records and the ability to suppress investigations. When I started pulling threads, I hit a wall. My supervisor, a woman named Carla Morrison, told me to drop it, said the patterns were coincidental. When I persisted, I was reassigned, then eventually forced to resign after a complaint was filed against me. Accusation of inappropriate conduct with a witness. It was fabricated. Ava's mind raced. She'd seen this before in her research, the systematic silencing of investigators who got too close to uncomfortable truths. But she'd assumed it was usually paranoia, the mind finding patterns in chaos. Now, sitting across from a broken man with documentation, the possibility felt devastatingly real. "Why come to me now?" she asked. "Because I've been watching your work for the past year. You're connecting new disappearances to the same pattern, which means it's still happening. And because I found something 3 months ago that changes everything, evidence that implicates someone with serious political power, I've been trying to figure out how to expose it without getting killed. And then I realized that I can't do it alone. I need a journalist, someone with a platform." The word "killed" hung between them like a physical thing. Over the next 4 hours, Daniel walked her through the cases one by one. A maintenance worker at a private immigration detention facility in Arizona who disappeared in 2017. His family told he'd abandoned them for California. A nurse with substance abuse issues from a rural clinic in Kentucky who vanished after reporting irregularities in pharmaceutical supplies to a DEA hotline. A psychology student in Colorado who'd been conducting research interviews with former cult members found nothing, but disappeared before completing her thesis. What emerged wasn't a conspiracy of fantasy. It was something worse, a systematic exploitation of America's most vulnerable people, facilitated by individuals within institutions meant to protect them. The disappearances weren't random. They were targeted removals of people who either knew something, could provide valuable information, or simply didn't matter enough for their absence to trigger serious investigation. By the time they finished, Ava's hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the clarity of purpose she hadn't felt since before Marcus died. Here was the chance to actually do something meaningful, not just process his death as tragedy, but potentially expose the system that had made him expendable. "I need to verify everything," she said, "independently. I can't publish anything without solid sourcing." "I know. That's why I brought you the physical files. Digital trails are too easily erased." Daniel closed the folder carefully. "There's a former FBI analyst named Rebecca Chen who worked with me on several of these cases. She left the Bureau 2 years ago and now consults with nonprofits investigating government abuse. If we can get her talking, we might be able to construct a timeline that proves systematic involvement. Where is she? Portland. And she's terrified. She's been in hiding, changing locations every few months, convinced that someone's trying to silence her too." Daniel met Ava's eyes. "If we approach her, we're committing to seeing this through. Once we start pulling these threads, the people responsible will know we're coming for them." Ava thought of Marcus. She thought of the 17 faces on her corkboard. She thought of all the others whose disappearances hadn't even been noticed yet. When do we leave? The Portland drizzle felt perpetually cold as Ava and Daniel watched Rebecca Chen's apartment building from a parked sedan across the street. Rebecca had taken her time responding to their initial contact, 3 days of silence that stretched into paranoia. When she finally agreed to meet, she'd specified the location. A public library during peak hours, somewhere she'd feel safe in crowds. She was smaller than Ava expected. Rebecca Chen moved through the library like a ghost, clutching a worn laptop bag, constantly scanning for threats. When she finally sat with them at a secluded corner table, she refused to order anything, refused to make eye contact for the first 5 minutes. "You're asking me to destroy my life," Rebecca said quietly. "Again. I'm asking you to tell the truth," Ava replied. "There's a difference." "There really isn't." Rebecca's voice was hollow. "When I worked the Marcus Morgan case, yes, I remember your brother, Daniel told me about him. I found inconsistencies in the tracking systems. His cell phone pinged a tower near a private contractor facility outside Cheyenne. The signal was routed and the data was altered. I reported it to my supervisor. Within a week, I was being investigated for accessing classified information without authorization. Within 2 weeks, I resigned before they could fire me. The words landed like stones. "What kind of facility?" Ava asked, her voice steady even as her heart rate accelerated. "Harmony Solutions. They contract with IC and local law enforcement for detention and processing services. On paper, they're legitimate. They hold undocumented immigrants pending deportation, facilitate background checks, manage data systems for regional police departments. In reality, they're a black box. No transparency, no public oversight, and their security protocols are the same as military installations." Daniel leaned forward. "You found evidence that they were detaining people beyond legal authority. I found evidence that they were detaining people who never went through any official process. I hacked into their appointment system, which sounds dramatic but was embarrassingly easy, and found dozens of names that never appeared in any government database, people who simply didn't exist officially. When I cross-referenced the names with missing persons reports from the relevant counties, I got matches. Perfect matches." Ava's mind was already working the angle. "How many?" "I found documentation for 43 individuals across a 3-year period. The number could be much higher. I was interrupted before I could finish my analysis." Rebecca's hands were trembling now. "The facility is run by a man named Victor Castellano. He's ex-military, ex-CIA, now a defense contractor worth hundreds of millions. He has connections to members of Congress, local government, law enforcement agencies. He's untouchable." "If you have documentation," Ava started, "I have encrypted files that I've been moving between cloud servers and external drives, moving them every month. The moment I hand them over or make them public, I become a liability to him. And Castellano deals with liabilities the way he deals with everything else, efficiently and without leaving evidence." The fear in Rebecca's voice wasn't paranoia. It was the justified terror of someone who understood how thoroughly institutional power could erase inconvenient people. "What happened to the people he was detaining?" Daniel asked softly. "That's what I couldn't find out. The records show intake, but no exit paperwork. No deportations, no releases, no transfers. They went into the facility and the documentation simply ended, as if they ceased to exist." Over the next 6 hours, they moved to a motel outside the city where Rebecca felt safer. She handed them her encrypted files and walked them through her methodology. What emerged was devastating: a network of facilities, both government and private, operating with minimal oversight. People moving through a system designed to be invisible. Vulnerable individuals who could be detained indefinitely, their disappearance never officially documented because they were never officially there. The facilities weren't concentration camps. This wasn't Nazi Germany, but it was something quieter, and more insidious, the weaponization of bureaucratic invisibility. People could vanish into the cracks of an overstretched system, and as long as no one important cared enough to investigate, the machinery would grind forward undisturbed. Marcus might have been detained here, Ava heard herself say. His disappearance never triggered an investigation because there was no investigation. He was just processed out of existence. The implications were crushing. Her brother's death, for she was certain now that he was dead, hadn't been an accident or a tragedy. It had been a systematic removal, facilitated by people in suits who determined that one more missing person wasn't worth examining too closely. "There's more," Rebecca said. "Castellano is planning to expand the operation. I found communications between him and several political figures discussing a new initiative. They're calling it Border Security Optimization. And they want to scale the detention and processing system to handle thousands of individuals per month, with even less oversight than currently exists. The proposal is being pushed through various channels, some political, some corporate, some military." "When?" Daniel demanded. "Early 2026. They're using the current political climate to justify it. Immigration anxiety, border concerns, general distrust in institutions. Castellano is positioning himself as the solution to a national problem. If he succeeds, he'll have the legal authority and government contracts to disappear people at an industrial scale." Ava felt something break inside her. All the skepticism, all the protective distance she'd built between herself and painful truths, it shattered. The world wasn't the rational, mostly predictable place she'd convinced herself it was. It was a place where systems could be weaponized, where vulnerable people could vanish into institutional darkness, where the truth could be buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic obfuscation. "We expose him," she said. "We publish everything, Rebecca's analysis, the documentation, the financial connections, all of it." "That won't work," Rebecca said. "He's lawyered up to an extraordinary degree. Every document has plausible deniability. Every connection can be explained as coincidence. And the moment we go public, his lawyers will start the legal machinery that will tie us up for years while he moves everything offshore and reorganizes under different names and corporate structures." "Then what do we do?" Ava heard the desperation in her own voice. "We find the people," Daniel said quietly. "We prove they're alive. Or if they're not, we find their bodies. We make it impossible for him to claim this never happened. One body, one identified victim, one piece of physical evidence that can't be contested, that changes everything." "How?" Rebecca asked. "You're talking about finding buried remains across multiple states with no clear search parameters." "I'm talking about starting with the one case we know something about," Daniel said, looking directly at Ava. "Your brother. If we can find Marcus, if we can prove he was detained at Harmony Solutions and disappeared from there, we have an anchor point, an identified victim. From there, we apply pressure to other cases. We push local law enforcement to exhume remains. We force an investigation that Castellano can't suppress." The weight of it settled on Ava like concrete. Finding Marcus meant revisiting the worst grief of her life. It meant accepting that her brother hadn't simply gotten lost on a hiking trail, that he'd been deliberately disappeared by people motivated by profit and efficiency. It also meant she finally had a chance to do something about it. The Wyoming State Police Office in Cheyenne smelled like old coffee and fluorescent light exhaustion. Detective Sarah Kim had been polite but clearly skeptical when Ava and Daniel presented their case for reopening the investigation into Marcus Morgan's disappearance. Kim was good at her job. Sharp eyes that assessed them carefully, questions that cut to the heart of their claims, but she was also a creature of institutional constraints. "You're asking me to believe that a major defense contractor has been systematically disappearing people through detention facilities," Kim said, leaning back in her chair, "without a single whistleblower going to the media, without investigative journalists picking up on a pattern, without any physical evidence. Teruoku, we have evidence," Ava said, pushing forward the encrypted documents Rebecca had provided. Financial records showing payments from Harmony Solutions to various law enforcement agencies. Emails discussing detention quotas. Facility logs that document individuals who never appeared in any government database. "I'm not a cybercrime specialist," Kim replied. "And frankly, if this documentation came from hacking into private servers, it's inadmissible and possibly evidence of crime on your part." Daniel had anticipated this. "Then focus on the Marcus Morgan case specifically. Request the cell tower data from the original investigation. Cross-reference it with Harmony Solutions property records. Interview the original search team about any unusual pressure to conclude the investigation quickly. Build a foundation that doesn't depend on Rebecca's evidence." What followed was 3 weeks of procedural grinding that tested every ounce of Ava's patience. Detective Kim was thorough but cautious, treating their suspicions with the professional skepticism appropriate to her position. But slowly, inconsistencies in the original investigation emerged. The search that was called off after 2 weeks, unusual for a missing hiker. The supervisor who'd pressured the team to conclude Marcus had gotten lost and probably drowned in a ravine. The lack of any serious search of the Harmony Solutions facility, which was located less than 15 miles from where Marcus was last seen. Rebecca, working remotely from a rented cabin in Montana, began analyzing public land records and identifying possible burial sites near the facility. Ava spent nights mapping geological surveys, looking for areas that would be suitable for clandestine graves. Locations that matched soil composition patterns that would preserve remains, areas isolated enough for undetected digging, but accessible enough to transport bodies. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a former Harmony Solutions security guard named Marcus Toledo, ironically sharing the first name with Ava's brother, who'd developed a conscience after his daughter was born. He reached out through an encrypted email to the address Ava had published in her freelance work, offering information in exchange for protective measures: relocation, new identity, placement in witness protection. Toledo provided details that changed everything. He described the facility's true operations, the off-book detainees, the unauthorized processing, the section of the building that officially didn't exist. He described the night Marcus Morgan was brought in, March 14th, unconscious, brought in on a private vehicle by 2 men in suits. He remembered the name because it matched his own first name. He remembered because the facility director had specifically instructed that this detainee was to be processed and cleared with prejudice, meaning the documentation would indicate he'd been released, when in fact he'd been dealt with differently. "Dealt with how?" Ava asked, though she already knew the answer in her bones. Toledo was silent for a long moment. "There's a section of the facility that used to be an agricultural storage area. During spring cleanup in 2015, before I started working there, they had it excavated and modified. Reinforced concrete walls, earth barriers, drainage systems. No one officially goes there, but I've heard things, rumors from the long-term staff. And the excavation team started their work on a grey November morning, with Detective Kim present, along with a county coroner and a forensic specialist brought in to manage the remains properly. The Harmony Solutions facility's owners tried to block the excavation with legal injunctions, claiming illegal trespassing and harassment. But the judicial system, once engaged, moved with inevitable gravity. A judge issued a warrant. Federal authorities became involved once the institutional scope became clear. What they found was a grave site that would haunt Ava for the rest of her life. 12 bodies, 12 people who'd been disappeared into the system and never came out. Marcus was one of them, identified through dental records and DNA analysis. The remains suggested they'd been buried over a period of several years, placed in unmarked graves without ceremony, treated as waste product rather than human beings. The news broke simultaneously across every major media outlet. Not through Ava's article alone. She'd coordinated the release with 3 other investigative journalists at major publications, but as the kind of institutional crisis that demanded immediate coverage. The United States had its own disappearances, not in some distant authoritarian country, but here in Wyoming, facilitated by a government contractor with millions in federal contracts. Victor Castellano was arrested within 48 hours before he could flee the country. His lawyers immediately began constructing the narrative of reasonable doubt, claims that he was unaware of what lower-level employees were doing, that the facility was mismanaged without his knowledge, that he was the victim of a conspiracy by disgruntled workers. It was the standard play for powerful people facing accountability. Distance, deflection, delegation. But the game had changed. With 12 identified victims, with physical evidence that couldn't be contested, with Rebecca's encrypted documentation providing the paper trail of institutional complicity, the machinery of justice, slower and more imperfect than anyone would prefer, finally began to move. Ava stood at Marcus's funeral service on a cold December afternoon, watching his body finally be laid to rest after 9 months of investigation and a year of mystery. Her parents, hollow-eyed with the delayed grief of finally knowing what happened to their son, wept quietly beside the grave. Daniel stood nearby, watching the proceedings with the expression of someone who'd finally discharged a years-long debt. "You did it," he said when the service concluded, and Ava turned away from the grave. "We did it," she corrected, "and it's not over." Rebecca's analysis showed that the detention and processing of unauthorized detainees happened at 11 different facilities across 6 states. Castellano was part of a larger network. There are other people involved, other facilities, other missing persons. "How many?" Daniel asked, though she suspected he already knew the answer. "I don't know yet. Maybe dozens. Maybe more." Ava looked back at Marcus's grave. "But now we have a process. Now we have proof that it's possible to expose this. Now people will listen when we come forward with evidence instead of dismissing it as conspiracy theory." The cost of that victory had been enormous. Marcus was gone. Rebecca was living in protective custody, her life permanently altered. Daniel had agreed to testify against Castellano and had likely made himself a permanent target for retaliation. Ava herself had received threats, had been doxxed online, had become a polarizing figure depending on how people positioned themselves relative to questions of institutional accountability and border security. But the truth was undeniably public now. The people who'd vanished had faces and names and families who mourned them. The system that had made their disappearance possible had been exposed and forced into reckoning. It was imperfect justice, the kind that came too late and never fully healed the wounds it addressed. But it was something. As winter deepened across Wyoming, Ava Morgan returned to her apartment in Denver and added something new to her corkboard. A photograph of all 12 victims from the burial site, their names listed below in careful handwriting. 12 faces representing something far larger, a pattern of institutional failure, of human vulnerability, of the fragile line between visibility and erasure that determined whether a missing person's case was treated as tragedy or inconvenience. She had another investigation to start. There would be more names to document, more families to contact, more truths to excavate from beneath layers of official silence. The work would be consuming and dangerous and probably endless. But it would also be necessary. And for the first time since Marcus disappeared, Ava Morgan felt like she was finally doing something that mattered.